So here's why I think timelines are interesting, and why you might want to add them to your note-taking and presentation toolkit. What this simple diagram helps you to do is understand the past, plan for the future, and contextualize the present. It helps you to see trends that you might otherwise miss, spot gaps in the plans for your upcoming project, and better understand and appreciate where you are right now. But here's the thing though, when creating timelines, you don't have to stick to this linear left to right structure here. And in this video, I'm going to share a set of timeline structures that you can pull into your workflow when you're capturing, processing, or sharing ideas. The first structure that I'll identify is the one that you've seen, this horizontal structure here, where time moves left to right, and the elements that you add to your timeline can either go above or below that line. This is the structure that you are no doubt the most familiar with. Here's an example from when I was working on a resource called Build an Online Course with Sketchnotes. This is a sketch that I created to communicate the release dates of each of the units within that resource. In this case, there's not a single continuous arrow through all of those events, but instead smaller ones in between each with dates clearly marked at the bottom. So if you've got an upcoming process that you might want to communicate with others, the traditional horizontal timeline approach might work well for you. For the second structure here, let's flip that line and make it vertical instead. A top to bottom approach to a timeline just gives it a little bit different feel, and it might fit better for you depending on where and how you're sharing this timeline. One example of a vertical timeline like this that I found to be pretty intriguing was this one from Ava Lotta Lamb, who shared this in conjunction with a visual language / diagramming project. I like how she built in some hierarchy here, how the main steps of a line and then plan are what move you from top to bottom, but then extending horizontally out from each of those main sections, you can dig into what each of them mean, the steps within them. And I feel like this is a nice way to make use of all of the space within this square image here. Since we write horizontally, I feel like having the timeline move top to bottom leaves more space for that writing. Space for each of those 6 sub-steps that might be harder to fit in if your timeline moves left to right. So if you're sharing the timeline for the day's events for something that you're hosting, maybe try out a vertical timeline. Next, let's move away from purely linear structures and add some curves in. This structure here, I'm giving the name of tunnel because it kind of feels like you're tunneling down into the earth. And what I like about it is that it allows you to create a longer timeline within a rectangular space, more so than the previous 2 structures, without losing the clarity of the sequence of events that you're sharing. Here's an example of this timeline format in action. This is a video in which I shared the path that I went down that led to me becoming a sketchnote educator. So in this case, I'm sharing my educational and professional history to give some context to the work that I do now. And here you can see the benefits as the viewer of seeing the timeline go from being empty to filling one element at a time. If you're just shown the final full timeline, it might seem a little cluttered or daunting, but when you share it element by element, I think it's easier for folks to follow along, which is something to keep in mind if you're using a timeline as a presentation tool. You wouldn't necessarily have to make a video like this one. You could instead just share a sequence of images, one new timeline event added to each image. For the next structure, we're again going to use a curved line to fill the page. This one looking like more of a journey, which I've given the title of a roadmap. This one could be an interesting and helpful approach if you'd like to give meaning to each of those curves, because I think that can help add some nuance, some feeling to the experience that you're communicating. Here's an example of some sketch notes that I took that use this type of timeline. Here I'm sharing some ideas from Elizabeth Gilbert during her interview on the Chase Jarvis live show, in which she talks about the idea of learning in public. How when you're going through life and experience something that causes you to learn something new, maybe about yourself, maybe about the world, the benefit that can come from sharing that thing you learned, because in communicating it to others and putting that out there, that might actually help you to stay on this path that's closer to reality, as opposed to going down more delusional pathways that are easy to go down when you're just ruminating about things in your own head and not talking to others about about them. And in that way, learning in public can help you achieve this compassionate alignment with reality. I really enjoyed that phrase that Gilbert shared, and I think what this example shows is how helpful it can also be to show what happens outside of the timeline if you veer from it, what that veering away from the timeline might mean for the example that you're sharing. So keep in mind this roadmap structure if the thing that you're sharing is more of a journey. And finally, the last structure here, which might be the most interesting to me right now, is a circular timeline. This structure works well for any type of cyclical process. That cycle could be a single day, maybe a month, or even a year. And what I really like about this structure is how you can make use of the full page by extending those divider lines out to the edges. Here's an example of how I used that structure to communicate my current daily routine. And taking a close look at my daily routine is something that I do annually. But this was the first time that I had used this particular format to think through it myself and communicate it in this way. And I appreciated the picture it gave to my day, especially being able to identify these different sections of heavy structure in the morning, then medium structure, then lighter at the end. So for me, this was a way to see how different ways of capturing a process helped me to see something about that process that I might not have otherwise seen, and then how that made it easier to communicate that to others. I decided to try out that circular timeline to share my daily routine because of this image shared by Heather Martinez, which shows some yearly planning, using a similar circular approach to plan out an entire year. This following along with the work of Brandy Agerbeck, who you can see on the screen in the background there. These are two folks doing very interesting work in the field of visual thinking, along with Ava Lada Lamb, whose work I shared earlier. I will link to their stuff down below. Do go check it out. And keep in mind this circular timeline structure anytime you're capturing a process that repeats itself. So the next time that you're trying to wrap your head around something that happened in the past, you're planning for something in the future, or you're trying to just better understand what's going on in the present, try sketching things out using one of these timeline structures. Pick the one that feels like the best fit for the situation you're dealing with and give it a go. And if you're interested in building other visual thinking skills like this one, do check out the resources available at verbaltovisual.com. I've got lots of other videos and courses there. If you're just getting started, I encourage you to check out An Introduction to Visual Note-Taking. I've shared a link to that course and others down below. Thank you so much for watching. Good luck putting one or more of these timeline structures to use yourself, and I'll talk to you again in the next video. Until then.